virtual mic to you.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you so much. It is very good to be with you here today. I'm a graduate of Garrett up in Evanston. That was 30 years ago. I loved my time in seminary. I didn't want to leave. I cherished it. Little did I know I was supposed to cherish being face to face as well. So at any rate, I hope you're enjoying your seminary experience as well. It's great to be with you today. As I move about our country, it strikes me how very little we know about how things got set up in our country for workers and how much we differ from Europe and Canada. So, if you will allow me, I am going to do a quick run through 400 years of history, weaving in what the Black Lives Matter movement is teaching us right now, as well as how faith traditions have responded to different pieces of history. So, we live in a society that is racist, and the workplace is also racist. No surprise there. I think the Black Lives Matter movement points to the how the economic system of our country got started, and how we are still living with that 400 years later. So to begin, slavery did not just benefit a few people. In fact, all 13 colonies had slaves. There were dock workers in Boston who were slaves. And so eventually our country shifts slavery to just be in the South. Cotton becomes this great big business. And suddenly the exploitation of slavery is at the core of our economy. So the origins of how our economy got established in our country are very important. So I do, of course, want to note that when slavery was abolished, the faith community played a very vital role, and I think we still have a very significant role to play in current times as well. So these slavery roots influence the US heavily. We demand cheap labor in our country. We are the world's strongest economy, but we are also the world's strongest cultural we have the world's strongest culture of putting profits before people. And we can certainly see how that's been played out in the pandemic as well. But again, faith communities have responded to this. I'm a United Methodist pastor. We have our United Methodist social principles. The UCC has social principles as well. Virtually every major faith tradition has some guiding social justice principles that also address the economy. And so I believe as faith leaders, we need to call upon these principles as often as possible. So now I'm going to fast forward to the 1930s. And we, of course, are in this depression. The times now have been compared to the 1930s pretty consistently, huh? So what did Roosevelt do? So he established the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established in 1935 a minimum wage. Imagine that. We didn't have one before. They also abolished child labor, all good things. But it's significant to note that in that moment, there were two groups of workers who were excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this is a moment of labor history where you can really point to systemic racism having very deep roots. The first was domestic workers were excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, and you did not have to pay your domestic worker, the person who came into your house to clean or cook or care for your elderly. You didn't have to pay them any certain wage. They could work, 120 hours a week. That didn't matter. And of course, most of those workers were African Americans. The other group that we excluded were the farm workers. And that is predominantly Latino workers. So now we're going to look at towards the end of 1930s and look at what happens in Flint, Michigan in 1937. There are a group of auto workers who have miserable working conditions, miserable wages. And in Flint, Michigan, two days before New Year's Day on 1937, they decide to sit down and take over the plant. And they stayed in the plant for 44 days. And this is really one of the significant landmarks in the labor movement in our country, because then those workers were unionized. And so at that time, we also see unionization spreading to the steel mills. We see sit-down strikes in even places like Woolworth's dime store, where the workers sat down at the counters and decided that they wanted fair wages as well. So really, in the late 1930s, we see workers starting to establish a middle class. And in this time in history, we are also witnessing the Great Migration. And so African Americans are coming north, and they too can have middle class wages and come to work in steel mills and auto plants and rubber plants. It's not a panacea by any means, but unions are the great equalizer, right? So that everyone on the production line is being paid the same wage and treated supposedly fairly. So if we take a snapshot of our country in 1955, one third of our workforce was unionized. So here we are coming out of World War II, and we're building our country, and we build, and people can get homes and they can have a college education, and a third of the people are in unions. And we're really going someplace in our country. I'm not trying to idolize the 1950s by any stretch of the imagination, but the fact that 1/3 of the workers were in unions is very, very exciting. And that snapshot is from 1955. So then we come into the civil rights movement, and I just want to say, of course, you know, the church was at the core of that, thankfully. But I also want to mention that a lot of unions also participated in the civil rights movement. The United Auto Workers in particular were very significant, played a significant role in the March on Washington in 1963, and funded some of the freedom rides and some of the trainings, et cetera. But as unions are growing, businesses are fearful. Oh, workers have too much control. Workers have too much power in the workplace. And so we arrive to the 1980s, and we see President Reagan come into office, and his rhetoric is all anti-union. And at the same time in our country, we are deindustrializing and deregulating and deunionizing and just pulling that fabric apart that we had been building up. And of course, this is when we also see the rise of the Koch brothers and other right-wing forces. And so now we have fewer jobs. We still have work, and so now workers are having to fight each other, you know, and fight for crumbs under the table. So I want to just shift our focus away from the US just for a minute and look at Europe and Canada, also industrialized countries, right? So Europe has the strongest laws to protect workers. In fact, in France, 90% of the workers are covered by a collective bargaining agreement. I'll also add, in Canada, I was doing some work in Canada in 07, 08, and the clergy were organizing into a union back then. That's a whole nother story in itself. But anyway, so we go from 1955, where 1 in 3 workers is in a union, and now today, if you include the public sector, it's 11%. However, in Europe, everyone has a living wage and healthcare and paid vacation and paid sick days and paid maternity leave and pension. But here we are in the US with our go it alone, cowboy independence, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, you know, the individualism that permeates our culture. and we don't have any of these things, and you really have to fight for them. And if you're a worker of color, you have to fight twice as hard. The pandemic really exposed the healthcare crisis and the fact that many people do not have healthcare, and that as folks were losing their jobs, they were losing their healthcare. That's a disaster way to form a country, but that's where we're at, unlike our European counterparts. In addition, we have the worst labor laws of the entire industrialized country. It used to be that South Africa was below us, but with the ending of apartheid, their labor laws actually became better than ours. So this is the environment into which workers enter, having to fight for every crumb of dignity and every dollar. And in addition, in the 1980s, there was a big industry. It never really existed before, but it's a union busting industry. And it's a $19 billion a year industry to fight against workers who are trying to unionize. When workers don't have a union, they are at-will employees. They really don't have any power on the job. They have lower wages, usually by about 25% lower than their union counterparts. They have unsafe conditions. And if you were exploited and in unsafe conditions before COVID-19, it got much worse in COVID-19. And Rachel and I are going to talk about that a little bit together. In our country, there is no paid sick days, vacation, healthcare, pension. It's as if we're operating as if we're a third world country, and low wage workers in particular are disposable. There's very, very little accountability in our country for how we treat workers. And if you're an immigrant worker, it's 10 times worse. At Arise Chicago, we teach workers about their rights. If I can just give you a quick snapshot of one day in Cook County, the county that we're in, over $1 million a day is stolen from mostly low-wage immigrant workers. And that's by not paying them proper minimum wage or proper overtime, forcing them to work off the clock, etc. So it's a dire situation that we're in. And even before COVID, workplace deaths have been rising under the current administration, up 7%. Workplace deaths are up 7%. This is before COVID, since 2016. And OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, is incredibly weak under the current administration. I'm sure that that is no shock there. I believe if you work 40 hours a week, you should make $50,000 a year, and that's what minimum wage should be. $25 an hour, so that you don't have to take a second job, and so that you are home for your family, for your own health, for your own life and worship community. You know, I do want to mention back in 2010, 2011, we started the, not we, but we joined the Fight for 15 movement, and it looked ridiculous to think that workers could have $15 an hour. But workers fought for it, and they marched in the streets, and they were, you know, striking. And sure enough, it's a slower than we want it to be, but sure enough, now in Illinois, we are going to go to $15 an hour. So I think I will stop there, if that's okay, and kind of enter into a discussion and get and turn it over to Rachel at this point. Is that correct?
So I want to engage with you in some conversation, and then we'll open up to questions and thoughts from the community.
Great.
And then we'll pivot a little bit, and I'll offer some reflections. So the pandemic's hit many workers very hard, as you've indicated. Significant numbers became unemployed or underemployed. Working conditions worsened, as you mentioned. As people have been thrust into perilous situations where they're required to perform jobs that expose them to COVID-19 risks. And of course, we're all distracted by the pandemic, so all kinds of other supervision, regulation, et cetera, is even worse than it used to be. So I know Arise has been really stepping up in some important ways. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about the work you're doing now?
Sure, sure. Before beginning that, I do also want to recognize John Thomas, who's on the call and faculty member at CTS and our board president for 6 years. And we are just very, very proud to have his presence at Arise. So thank you, John. Thank you for this connection too. So when the pandemic hit, I mean, everyone was thrown off balance, right? But as I said, basically the rule of thumb was if you were in danger before the pandemic, now your very life was at risk across the board without a doubt. Very early on in the pandemic, there was a pizza place and they had like 5 drivers. So of course they all knew each other. They gather every night at 5 o'clock and, stand around the counter and wait for their orders to drive away. And one of them just disappeared. And the other 4 workers kept asking about, well, what happened? What happened? And the owner won't say anything. Finally, about the 3rd or 4th day, he said, oh, he died. He died of COVID. And the workers were like, what? Why didn't you tell us? And he says, well, I didn't want to upset you. When really these workers should have been quarantining for 14 days. We also believe at Arise that they should get paid. The CARES Act covers that, but if you're at a workplace under 50 employees, CARES Act doesn't cover you for those 2 weeks off of quarantining. At any rate, what happened at that pizza place, we saw play out over and over again at virtually every employer. There's a food processing plant in Bedford Park. They have over 100 workers, and a few of them turned up COVID positive, and the owner of the establishment wasn't going to do anything. Everyone's still shoulder to shoulder. There's no mask, there's no PPE, there's no hand washing or sanitizing. And at Arise Chicago, we were able to lead 60 workers out on a health strike for 2 weeks. They had encountered someone who's COVID positive. They need to go off and quarantine for 2 weeks and take care of themselves and their families, just like all of us who are working remotely would do. And so 60 of the workers did indeed join us. There was one worker who came to us and said, I'm supporting my mom and dad. I live with them. I buy the groceries and get their medicines. I'm the only outside contact they have. I just really don't want to quarantine because they were going to be doing it without any pay. And so he decided to stay on in the workplace. And he called us about 3 weeks later and he said, my father just died. This gentleman, unbeknownst to himself, was asymptomatic, carrying COVID, and gave it to his dad. Again, his parents didn't go out at all. He called us a week later. My mother just died. As pastors, as faith leaders, as rabbis, we can only imagine what kind of life that this young man is going to have. He's in his early 30s. Just absolutely devastating. So again, it really does almost like tie to slavery, like somehow, as a society, we believe that these essential workers should, stay on the job at all costs. I want to mention one last thing about this place. When we all first went on lockdown in March, I'm like, okay, essential workers who make food. This place in Bedford Park, they make flan, jello, and pudding. And I'm scratching my head like, is this essential? Do we really need flan, jello, and pudding in our society? So even that's pretty maddening as well. I'll stop there, Rachel.
So some of what I've seen Arise doing is also appears to be more direct one-to-one kind of worker support. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Sure. We went home and started working remotely in a week before the pandemic. So kind of when everyone was on lockdown, we kind of were able to hit the ground running. And our phone calls went from 25 or 50 a week up to 160 a week. It was maddening chaos, and we wanted to respond to each and every worker. Because we had our ear to the ground, we knew what workers were looking for. So we created videos about staying safe on the job, workers' compensation, et cetera, et cetera. And so since the pandemic, we have created videos in English, Spanish, and Polish, and they have had 460,000 views. So we're touching the right core there.
Speaking of videos, you also previewed a film at your virtual gala. Can you tell folks a little bit about it? And then Lisa could put a link in the chat for people who might want to see it, who are interested.
Oh, how kind, how very kind. So yeah, in years past, CTS has had a table. Every year we gather 500 or 600 faith, labor, and community leaders together in person to talk about workers' rights and what the faith community has to say about that. We couldn't do it this year. Instead, we created a 50-minute video. And during that video, we have an 18-minute segment of workers having experienced COVID-19 on the job. We have them basically giving a witness of what has happened in their lives. It's very, very powerful. The majority of it is in Spanish with captions underneath. This is probably the most affirming part of the breakfast. There's other parts to it as well, but if you watch it, I highly recommend to go. I think it's about the 10-minute mark where workers come on.
Always wonderful, always best to have people telling their own stories. I mean, there's nothing
Totally
more powerful. So how could students and community members get involved in the work?
Well, I'm happy to talk to anybody one-on-one and kind of explore what folks are interested in. There are all sorts of campaigns still going on that are COVID related and even non-COVID. Exploitation is still happening in the workplace even without COVID. John and I were recently speaking at a press conference where workers who had formed a union then got fired. The boss lied and said that he was moving the plant and he never did. I mean, all kinds of injustices are still going on. You know, if anyone's comfortable coming out to those events, we welcome you. We also have petitions to sign on. We just had a labor in the pulpit in September, and we had speakers or a reflection piece in over 100 services, and a lot of them were in UCC and synagogues and Methodist and Catholic services. So it's another way to, again, weave that sacred link between faith and work.
I wrote one of those.
Yes, yes, you did. It was beautiful. It was about bread, I remember.
So thank you for all of that. I want to ask one more question, then we'll open up to the community to engage with you. I want to go back to the substance of your talk a little bit and lift up specifically the role of religious voices and communities in some of that history. And I'm thinking, of course, about the dilemma regarding community organizing, right? Like the power of fire can be used for good and evil. So we had, you know, many religious communities of diverse life stances engaged, for instance, in civil rights efforts, but also religious communities organizing against it, right? And using their religious traditions to make arguments that somehow this was against divine will. So I wanted to ask you to reflect just for a moment, because this is what's been occupying my mind a lot, on the role of religion in impacting the public square and what you think can be done to improve it.
Yeah, I think it's all the more important for voices to be out there. There was a moment, my denomination's messed up. I'm so glad none of yours are. You know, but about 2000, it's like, okay, for 20 years, we've been fighting about gay rights. Like, I'm so sick of this. I actually thought about just leaving. Like, I'm done with this. This is just so, you know, unfaithful. And then there was like this voice in me, like, I'll be darned if I'm leaving the church to them. You know, I want a church that I can raise my daughters in, and I want to instill a heritage in them that will ground them when a crisis like COVID hits, like they have a place to go, not necessarily the physical church, but they have a place to go deep in their souls, you know, to connect with the living God within them. And so I fought back out of my despair and said, by golly, let's own this corner. And so in the same way, I think a big part of being religious leaders in this moment is to be out on the street corners, to be out marching in the streets, to pray with our feet. And that really is what embodies, I believe, you know, what is meant in our scriptures. Just one last thing, you know, there's this moment where Moses is at the burning bush. He's very scared. He gives God 5 excuses. Don't choose me. No, not me. I'm not good enough. And eventually what God says to Moses is like, no, you're it, man. You know, let's go. And God says, I want you to lead my people out of oppressive working conditions. That was the most significant moment, I think, for the work that we all do together, because in that moment, God forever linked faith and work. And God sees them as this binded force. And so when we cross the threshold into the workplace, we are still sacred. We are still created in the image of God. And we need to be treated as such. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to open up. Lisa, will you shepherd this? Although I kind of want to